Africa has spoken, and as thousands have taken to the streets in various countries, the message is loud and clear. Africa hates France, and it wants nothing to do with the European nation.
Thousands of protesters gathered outside a French military base in Niamey on Friday to demand the withdrawal of France from the Sahel region.
Outside the French embassy in Kinshasa, protesters chanted, "Macron assassin" or "Macron get out."
Days after a military coup in Niger, protests and vandalism reportedly took place outside the French embassy in the African country. The demonstrators shouted slogans like "Long live Putin," "Down with France," and a plaque at the French embassy was replaced with Russian and Niger flags.
Over the past few years, the citizens in various Western African countries have started to publicly oppose French interference. The unrest has been rising month over month to the point where now, French embassies are being burnt and African presidents are scolding France at presidential summits. But how did the relationship between France and its former allies get so bad? What has President Emmanuel Macron done to fix the situation? Lastly, what role do Russia and China have to play in all of this? And what is the ultimate agenda? In today's video, we will be exploring all these questions and providing the answers for you. What we can say is this is a turning point in the tide of European-African relations. A new age is coming. As we hop onto the subject of strained relationship, help ours by dropping a like on this video. The YouTube algorithm hasn't been friendly to us and the reach of all our recent videos has been horrible. Your likes will go a long way in helping the Public Court of Appeal and mending our relationship with the YouTube algorithm. Let's hope it goes a bit better than President Macron's appeals to African nations, because, that's a bit of a mess. Okay, back to the basics. The relationship between France and various African nations has been interesting and forged over decades at various levels. France, having been a colonizer for many years, still maintained relationships with its former colonies and protectorates, and these are the relationships that are in jeopardy today. A huge part of the reason for the criticism that France is facing is deeply rooted in a feeling that colonialist practices and paternalistic attitudes never really ended. Most Western African citizens believe that France is a master puppet controller and that for decades it has toyed with the fate of Africa. Let's dive deeper. The French presence in Africa dates back to the 17th century, but the main period of colonial expansion came in the 19th century with the invasion of Ottoman Algiers in 1830 and conquests in West and Equatorial Africa during the so-called Scramble for Africa. Just for clarity, the Scramble for Africa is the name given to the way in which European countries brought nearly all of the African continent under their control as part of their separate empires. The Scramble for Africa began in the 1880s as European nations divided up Africa into their territories. By then, Europe has firepower, muskets, and gunpowder. African tribes had leather hides and spears. Wasn't much of a fair fight, to be honest. It's no surprise then that by 1914, all but 2 African countries were under the control of European powers, with France being one of the major colonizers. This expansion and colonialism of Africa kept going on. Post-World War I, French expanded its empire, and by 1930, French colonial Africa encompassed the vast confederations of French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, the Western Maghreb, the Indian Ocean islands of Madagascar, Reunion, and the Comoros, and Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. Within this African empire, territories in sub-Saharan Africa were treated primarily as colonies of exploitation, while a settler colonial model guided colonization efforts in the Maghreb, although only Algeria drew many European immigrants. Throughout Africa, French rule was characterized by sharp contradictions between a rhetorical commitment to the civilization of indigenous people through cultural, political, and economic reform, and the harsh realities of violent conquest, economic exploitation, legal inequality, and socio-cultural disruption. This is a theme that you will soon see in the modern-day age when we talk about Franco Freak. At the same time, French domination was never as complete as the solid blue swaths on maps of Greater France would suggest. As in all empires, colonized people throughout French Africa developed strategies to resist or evade French authority, subvert or co-opt the so-called civilizing mission, and cope with the upheavals of occupation. After the First World War, new and more organized forms of contestation emerged as Western-educated reformers, nationalists, and trade unions pressed by a variety of means for a more equitable distribution of political and administrative power. Frustrated in the interwar period, these demands for change spurred the process of decolonization after the Second World War. Eventually, after years of negotiations and conflict, many of these African nations obtained their independence from France. This is where a big part of the problem begins. Where other colonizing nations like Great Britain and Germany left the African continent and returned to their nations after losing control, France did not. For decades, since they formally let go of their former colonies, France has kept close but complicated ties with many former colonies, including a military presence, economic influence, and direct access to heads of state, a web often referred to as Franco Freak, that came to embody France's obsession with keeping a foothold there. This term, Franco Freak, is a term that is at the heart of Africa's displeasure with France in the here and now. You see, even after formally relinquished control over African nations, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, France, having enriched itself by exploiting energy resources and mines in its colonies, was eager to keep privileged access to such resources. I mean, it's no secret that Africa is rich and France simply would not let go of that cash cow. France was also preoccupied with its image as a world power and saw sub-Saharan Africa as its own backyard, an extension of itself. To this end, France sought to protect itself against both Soviet and American influence by maintaining military bases throughout the region. General Charles de Gaulle, then president of France, saw an opportunity to maintain his country's influence in sub-Saharan Africa by creating a web of relations that would serve its economic, diplomatic, ideological, and domestic political goals. Despite being free decades earlier, France kept using African money and resources to finance its own political parties almost as tribute. No, really, it came off as a tribute. In 2011, the issue of French presidents receiving money from African heads of state was quite the story, with The Guardian posting this headline. It was revealed that African emissaries traveled to France with suitcases full of cash, seeking, regardless of who won the election, to cement French politicians' loyalty and support for their nations. The fact that France tolerated this and kept receiving what is tantamount to tribute in exchange for favors, and kept draining African resources, is an issue. A big issue. It wasn't until 2012 that this practice of Franco Freak was put to task, when the president François Hollande stated it was time to end Franco Freak. Nevertheless, despite all that talk, France has maintained influence in the region to this day, in the name of security interests. Again, you don't just let go of the cash cow. Another reason why France has been able to keep a grip on African nations, as it's often argued, is because of the use of the CFA Franc, a currency. This is the full name: Franc de la Communauté Financière Africaine. You can read it aloud yourself. We're not about to try. Anyway, the creation of the CFA Franc was one of the central elements of French policy in sub-Saharan Africa, as the CFA Franc became the currency of sub-Saharan Africa's French colonies. This currency was pegged to the African franc and later to the euro. Two separate currencies were created from this: the Central African franc for Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon, and the West African franc for Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. In practice, however, both currencies were at parity and interchangeable. Paris mandated that the African central banks maintain between 50 to 65% of their foreign reserves in France's central bank to guarantee the convertibility of the CFA at a fixed exchange rate. Again, this is something that has been debated all across Africa for years. Is this method of creating a currency and dictating how it's held and how its reserves are dealt with not economic colonialism? Eventually, as the issues boiled over on December 22, 2019, France and 8 West African governments announced that they would replace the CFA franc with a new currency, still pegged to the euro, called the ECO. Looking back at it now, that was when the wave of change started creeping up, settling West Africa alight to a blazing revolution. A blazing revolution that looks like this.
A few dozen Congolese demonstrated Wednesday against the arrival of the French president in the DRC.
It was march in the streets of Niger's capital, Niamey, a show of support for a military coup that has shaken many West African countries and their international backers.
Supporters of the coup gathered outside the French embassy, a former colonial power.
We've given you the background. Now let us catch you up to modern problems. Let's start with Niger and West Africa. You already know that Niger is in a disastrous situation right now, with the nation on the cusp of a vicious collapse. If you haven't seen our video and Russia's role in it, please take a quick look. You'll find it interesting, albeit sad as all wars are. Niger is the most recent in what appears to be a pattern that nations in West Africa that were once French colonies are following. This pattern is characterized by a coup, where the army seizes control and takes over the nation. This has already happened in nations like Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and Chad, all former French colonies. We'll touch on them in a few minutes. At this point, you're probably thinking, well, coups are happening everywhere in Africa. This isn't abnormal. Well, yes, but no. You see, since 1990, a striking 78% of the 27 coups in sub-Saharan Africa have occurred in Francophone states. Yes, all the nations that had roots in French colonialism are now struggling with stability. Is that a coincidence or a legacy rooted in the inadequacies of a rotten system? We'll let you decide that. Back in Niger, the company's president, Mohamed Bazoum, a trusted ally of France, was taken hostage in the presidential palace by his own guards in late July. People had had enough of him, and enough of the French extended influence, so they decided to take matters into their own hands and depose him. To show just how much disdain was harbored amongst the people against France, the protesters marched to the French embassy and destroyed it. We mean they went to town on it, ultimately resulting in a broken and burnt building, one serving as a warning against further French involvement in the nation, and ultimately, Africa. As if the smashing and burning of France's premier building in the nation wasn't a clear enough sign, the day that followed saw a colonel in uniform appearing on state television to formally announce that the military was ending its cooperation with France. Until his dethroning, President Mohamed Bazoum had made Niger a clear Western ally in a troubled region, and a favored recipient of foreign aid. In fact, because of its close relationship with the West and undoubtedly French ties, no other nation but one in West Africa receives as much foreign aid as Niger. The nation, which has a population of 26.2 million, received $1.8 billion in aid in 2021. The only country to receive more in aid was Nigeria, which received $3.5 billion. But when you factor in population sizes, you'll see that for a population that's a tenth of Nigeria's, Niger has quite the advantage. Regardless of all this, half the population lives below the poverty line. That means that half the population lives on less than $2.15 a day. Imagine that. Could you do it? Niger has developed a reputation for being one of the poorest countries in the region, with repeated food shortages, and has one of the worst ratings on the Human Development Indices in the world. Even its people suffer, with Niger having a literacy rate of just 37%. Those are dismal numbers. So much for all the money, huh? We say all this to convey how poverty and the suffering of the masses have been key in Niger and West Africa's cries. This disconnection between having a lot of resources but still suffering has brought rise to discontent in the nation and hatred towards France, the assumed enemy of the people. Given that Niger is now in turmoil with the French allies, or maybe puppets depending on which side of the fence you're on, deposed, then that means that there's no more funding for Niger. On top of that, France had troops stationed in Niger, troops that are now unwanted by the people. In fact, France had several military bases in West Africa. Just take a look at this chart and see. France made sure it had quite the armed presence in Africa, something that has long been viewed as a show of power from an oppressor who won't leave. The Republic of Djibouti, for example, has the largest military base in Africa. The strategic position of the base on the Horn of Africa gives access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. It allows the Fifth Republic, France's current republican system of government, to conduct operations in East Africa and the Middle East. The French military base serves as a logistical hub for French military operations and as protection for French merchant ships in the economic corridor. The French army in Djibouti also supports the US and UN military and humanitarian missions in Africa, but that feels like a bonus if not an influential point in France's favor. There are also 4 French military bases in the Sahel region. This is the area that covers Senegal, Niger, Chad, and Côte d'Ivoire, all in which French bases were and are active. These bases serve as centers for French military operations against radical Islamist groups. They were erected and maintained under the presumption that French forces would operate from there to eradicate the radical Islam groups in the area. But well, they've not been efficient at all. These inefficiencies contribute to the rising French hate in Africa, as the French military is being viewed as freeloaders who are not bringing peace to the region as promised, and yet taking resources out. That's where Russia and China come in. But give us a second. We'll touch on that in just a minute. Let's finish this military base talk first. So you see how interconnected they are and the usefulness that France has milked from them. The bases in Niger and Chad are the main locations for military forces engaged in French military operations in the Sahel. On top of all this, the French base in Chad serves as a support center for opposition movements and terrorist groups in the Central African Republic that are fighting against the country's central government, another venture that's not yielding the expected results as well. The military base in Senegal serves as a logistics, intelligence, and surveillance center in West Africa, while the base in Côte d'Ivoire is the center of French security and interests in the Gulf of Guinea. From there, it coordinates anti-piracy activities and intercepts contraband, some of which sometimes ends up in the Ukraine. Lastly, the military base in Gabon serves as a logistics center for French forces engaged in operations in Central Africa. Gabon also hosts the remains of the French military contingent that left the Central African Republic last December. Some of these bases are not worth mentioning anymore, but it's good that we broke them all down so you can see just how the French government was deeply ingrained in the African continent. Under direction from Paris, over 1,500 French troops were deployed in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel, but they might not be around for much longer. If French troops leave Niger, as they are expected to, Chad would remain the only country in the Sahel region known to host a French base, thus greatly shrinking its military influence and presence. Seeing France evacuate over 500,000 of its nationals following the embassy attack really cemented the notion that France is done in Niger and shook the ground for its allies while adding passion to the protesters by validating their efforts. When it comes to Niger, no road leads to any sort of working together with France, and this is something set to keep spreading across Africa. The root of the coup against President Mohamed Bazoum was that he was and is a puppet for French interests. That has been the echoing rallying cry of the army and civilians protesting his reign. That was why as soon as the military took power, General Abdourahmane Chiani, the architect of this coup, instantly revoked about 5 military deals with France. This was to show a strong hand against their former colonizer and to sever ties with them. It's hard not to see where Niger's citizens and ultimately Africans are coming from. After all, for years, France has been seen as siphoning resources from the continent back to Paris. Even long after obtaining independence from their colonizer, it seems to the people of Niger that France has had a say in everything related to Niger, all while pillaging its resources still. To date, Niger accounts for about 10% of the France's uranium supply for its nuclear reactors. That is not a small figure. From the eyes of the civilians, the trade deals are unfair, and more often than not, it seems that France takes more than it gives. The so-called military capacity it offers to prevent counterterrorism as well, not all that helpful it seems. It's not just Niger alone that views the French in a negative light. All across Africa, the sentiment is shared. Colonel Abdoulaye Maïga, who was named prime minister by the military junta in Mali in September 2022, launched a scathing attack on France, saying that France had neo-colonialist, condescending, paternalist, and vengeful policies. He also said that France had disowned universal moral values and stabbed Mali in the back. Burkina Faso carried the same sentiment too. There, the military government entered a long-standing accord that allowed French troops to operate in the country in February, giving France 1 month to remove its forces. Burkina Faso has realized that they are better off without French intervention and siphoning. And while it seems that Niger, along with other African countries, is done with France, relationships are being fostered with other great powers. One of them is Europe's own villain, Russia. When the Niger coup took place and the French embassy was burned to the ground, protesters who were responsible brandished Russian flags, with many of them chanting Vladimir Putin's name. Simply put, they were calling for Russia to replace France as their biggest global backer. Given the current hostilities that are taking place in Europe, it seems that France and Russia are fighting another war of influence far from home, in Africa. And unlike the European war, Russia is winning this one. In many West African countries like Ghana, Guinea, and Mali, Russia is remembered as a savior of sorts. This is because the Soviet Union was seen as a potent anti-colonial force that sought to free Africans from European, American, and capitalist oppression. Back then, Soviet involvement in Africa was widespread, featuring economic and military assistance for socialist-leaning governments and militias fighting liberation wars. Then and since, Russia has maintained a decades-long diplomatic presence in most African countries. This is why its influence is deeply rooted and grounded more so than any European nation. To add to that, in recent years, Russian arms transfers have poured into Africa, providing 40% of arms imported by African countries since 2018. In fact, Russia overtook China as the top weapons supplier to sub-Saharan Africa between 2018 and 2022. Meanwhile, the state-sponsored Wagner mercenary group has become deeply involved in the security interests of countries such as the Central African Republic and Sudan, providing not only military training, but also security for gold and other mines, in return for a share of the profits. They also seem to do a better job than France's mock special forces, so yeah, that just adds points to Russia's favor. In some countries, observers have established a link between Russian arms sale in Africa and the presence of Russia's Wagner Group mercenary force. Another reason why Russia is gaining ground at the expense of other nations is simply the fact that Russia has an advantage that directly solves a problem that African nations have. One word: food. Africa has a severe food import dependence that places Russia in a unique position that neither France, the US, nor others can easily fill. In 2019, Russia was the world's largest producer of barley, the third largest producer and the largest exporter of wheat, the second largest producer of sunflower seeds, the third largest producer of potatoes and milk, and the sixth largest producer of eggs and chicken meat. That is a deep coverage of all the bases that Russia has right there. It's easy to see why many African countries have become dependent on and appreciative of Russia. As if all that isn't enough, Russia has allegedly run heavy disinformation campaigns that have also increased its influence. This can be seen through the anti-colonialist memes that have turned into action in the streets of Chad, Mali, and elsewhere on the continent. All these cash-ins from the food dependency, arms being supplied, savior mentality, and disinformation campaigns have reaped massive benefits for Russia. This can be seen in just how, with repeated UN General Assembly votes, several African nations have either voted against or abstained from condemning Russia's war in Ukraine. Ultimately, it's simple to see that in Africa, the Russian flag is clearly flying high. Quite literally, actually. Last year, protesters waved Russian flags following a coup in Burkina Faso. This year, it is Niger. Who knows how far this influence will spread? And as Russia is embraced, Europe and America are more and more alienated. While still on that topic, China is another likely winner in this booting France mess. You see, China is Niger's second largest foreign investor after France. As most of you know, the Chinese government has been making substantial investments in African nations in pursuit of new markets and new partners. In the past 20 years, China has invested billions of dollars into Niger, most of it directed towards the exploration of oil and uranium. Since the coup started, China has only spoken out urging parties in Niger to safeguard stability. China's foreign ministry said in a written statement to Reuters, "We believe that Niger and regional countries have the wisdom and capability to find a political resolution to the current situation." The reality of the situation is that with France being taken out of the way, China can hope to capitalize on the market share and take over even more business, which ultimately means closer relations and more money for them. It's no wonder the Chinese government has not directly condemned the coup, as it is prioritizing its financial interests over the military affairs of another nation. It's not just in Niger either. China has Africa in a headlock. As someone once elegantly put it, China may have missed the European scramble for Africa that characterized the turn of the last century, but it has been making up for this since the 1950s. The pace of China's investment has increased in the past couple of decades. According to China's Ministry of Commerce, Chinese foreign direct investment in Africa grew at an average compound rate of 18% per year from 2004 to 2016. On top of that, China's lending activities in Africa dwarf their FDI investment. Financing of Chinese contracted projects in Africa has also been increasing and peaked in 2015 at USD $55 billion, almost 20 times the level of FDI. Similarly, by 2016, China was the largest exporter to Africa, accounting for 17.5% of African imports. By mid-2017, more than 10,000 Chinese-owned companies were operating in Africa. Yes, over 10,000. The largest companies by value are state-owned enterprises that dominate in the energy, transportation, and resource sectors. It's no wonder that since 2010, a third of Africa's power grid and infrastructure have been financed and constructed by Chinese state-owned companies. Looking at these graphs on screen, you can see just how China's investment, aid, and business in Africa has steadily increased over the years. China isn't slowing down, and in the absence of France, it can only explode even higher. To add fuel to the fire, along with China's increased economic activity in Africa, there's increased political power too. When you examine this graph that shows the UN voting similarity between China and Africa as compared to the voting similarity between the US and Africa, the case becomes abundantly clear. Over the 18-year examination period displayed, political alignment between China and African countries increased by about 80%. In essence, China's investment in Africa ensures that its investment results in greater global consensus around Chinese interests. Finally, since African countries are more dependent on economic engagement, their willingness to oblige by China's wishes, especially regarding international issues, is strengthened due to their inability to exist without outside economic engagement. China is becoming a heavyweight, and the hatred towards France can only benefit China. If the US isn't careful, it's going to be entirely cast aside. The United States' approach to Africa has evolved over time and faced challenges in its engagement on the continent. The US hasn't had a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to relations in Africa. If anything, it has constantly been adjusting its African priorities to align with changing global dynamics. In prior decades, the US focused more on security and counterterrorism efforts, which needs to be evident in the eyes of the masses. That was to cement the role of the big, strong protector. Recently, however, there's been a greater emphasis on economic engagement, trade, investment, and sustainable development. The US has put in a lot of effort to solidify and expand its economic ties with African countries only on paper, but not in actuality. Seldom do these agreements have the practical, realizable impact as similar deals from the countries like China do. Also, despite the US encouraging American companies to invest in Africa in fields like energy, infrastructure, and technology sectors, this hasn't happened on as grand a scale as hoped for. According to the former Liberian minister, W. Gwide Moore, even though the West often encouraged their companies or multinational corporations to compete in Africa, the conditions and the cost they set are sometimes too expensive compared to the bid of Chinese companies. This results in the being bid out, and hence the tactical effect of American power is not seen on the ground. What the US seems to be good at and focusing on more is military cooperation. This includes supporting peacekeeping efforts, providing military aid, and conducting joint training exercises to strengthen regional security capabilities. When it comes to having arms in hand and bombing something, you can trust the American military to be there. In comparison to China and Russia, the US has also done a horrible job at branding themselves. The superiority position often taken by the US has resulted in African nations realizing that they are not a priority for the US. The US government's inconsistency in messaging has undermined the government's credibility and diminished its influence. Through the changing governments, which seem to be on the very different ends, there's been a shift in policy also accompanied by contradictory statements, and this has created confusion among African governments and populations. Through Russia's own information campaigns, the perception that the US is now viewed undermines the US's efforts to promote its initiatives, as it may be viewed as primarily pursuing its own strategic or economic objectives, rather than genuinely supporting African development. The US is losing grip, while China and Russia are tightening theirs. In the battle of influence, at this rate, the US might be on the ropes in years to come. Back to good old France. To just come against France, as if President Macron has not tried to rectify the issue, would be wrong. We're objective, so here's the objective truth. President Macron has been making efforts to improve relations between African nations. Whether there has been a hidden agenda to it or not is up to you to decide, but on the surface, actions have been taken to improve diplomacy. In his own words, he said, "The age of Franco Freak is well over. Sometimes I get the feeling that mindsets haven't moved along as much as we have, when I read, hear, and see people ascribing intentions to France that it doesn't have." Macron has further emphasized that France has absolutely no desire to return to past policies of interfering in Africa. To top all of this, as the president of France, Macron has increased financial aid to the continent, begun the return of cultural artifacts stolen during the colonial wars, and reached out beyond the usual intergovernment ties to engage younger generations in civil society. We've already mentioned how he has kept French troops in the Sahel to fight the jihadist militants that kill so many local civilians, police, and soldiers, and supported the regional bloc ECOWAS as it tries to defend electoral politics against military takeovers. Basically, he seems to be trying to right every wrong in the book and to clear France's name. This endeavor has even seen him fly to Rwanda to publicly acknowledge French failures during the 1994 genocide. Despite all these actions, France is being vilified across Africa. France is now unwanted, hated, despised, and replaced with nations like Russia and China. Only time can tell how the conflicts and coups raging across Africa will end, and if France will be able to survive the fallout at all. At the moment, the undeniable truth is that France is hated, but maybe time will change the sentiment. Maybe.